I thought we were saving a legacy, but I was actually funding my own execution. After wiping their debts and bankrolling their expansion, I found a secret blacklist with my name at the very top. They were planning to erase me from the history books using the exact money I gave them. I didn't just walk away, I burned their empire to the ground. The year was 2021. The air in Seattle was perpetually gray, a fitting backdrop for the life I was leading. A life of quiet desperation and relentless ambition. I wasn't just a coder, I was a man possessed. I lived in a basement that smelled of old coffee and ozone from overheated server racks. For 18 hours a day, the only things that existed were the blinking cursors on my monitors and the complex, beautiful chaos of the algorithms I was weaving into existence. I didn't care about a social life, I didn't care about the sun, and I certainly didn't care about money until I met Arian. Arian was everything I wasn't. He was polished, charismatic, and had a smile that felt like a warm handshake even when he was disagreeing with you. We met at a crowded tech meetup in a downtown hotel, both of us nursing lukewarm drinks while scanning the room for investors who never materialized. When he saw my prototype, a rudimentary AI-driven data management system, his eyes didn't glaze over like the others. He looked at me, leaned in, and said, "This isn't just software. This is a digital revolution." That night, Nexus Flow was born in the back of an Uber. We were an unlikely duo. I was the recluse who preferred the company of code, and he was the wolf who thrived in the boardroom. But we needed capital. I liquidated everything I had, my inheritance from my grandfather, my savings, even the small retirement fund I'd started at my first job. It totaled $150,000. It was a terrifying amount to put into a dream, but Arian's conviction was infectious. "We're not just building a product, Faisal," he'd say during those 3 a.m. work sessions. "We're building a kingdom." We didn't have a fancy office for the first year. We had a converted garage that was freezing in the winter and sweltering in the summer. We lived on instant ramen and hope. I remember one night, at 4 a.m., my back was aching and my eyes were burning from staring at the screen. I was ready to quit. I looked over at Arian, who was asleep on a beanbag chair in the corner, his phone still clutched in his hand. He looked exhausted, vulnerable. That was the moment I doubled down. I wasn't just working for a paycheck. I was working for the vision we shared. I was the architect of his dreams, and he was the builder of mine. Or so I thought. The reality of the corporate world is that there is no room for friendship in the engine room. Every line of code I wrote was a brick in a wall that I thought was protecting us. But as I would soon discover, those bricks were actually forming a cage. We finally landed our first major contract with a London-based logistics firm. It was a deal worth millions, the kind of break that makes or breaks a company. When the wire transfer hit our account, I remember the overwhelming sense of validation. We had done it. I was a co-founder, a pioneer, a man who had pulled himself out of the basement and into the boardroom. I signed the partnership agreements with a sense of pride that I can't even describe now, looking back. I trusted Arian implicitly. I gave him the keys to the kingdom because I thought we were the king and the queen. I never stopped to think about what happens when the king decides he doesn't need a partner anymore. By the second year, the smell of ramen in the garage had been replaced by the scent of expensive coffee and the sterile, recirculated air of a high-rise office in Manhattan. Nexus Flow wasn't just a startup anymore. It was a phenomenon. We had moved from 50 employees to nearly 200 in just 6 months. The pace was frenetic. We were hiring software architects, marketing gurus, and data analysts at a rate that left me spinning. But in this rush to scale, I started feeling like a ghost in my own machine. Arian, who had once been my sounding board, became a stranger. His presence in the office shifted from hands-on collaboration to a series of fleeting appearances. He'd arrive in custom-tailored suits, trailed by a phalanx of consultants, men and women with sharp eyes and even sharper haircuts who spoke in buzzwords I barely recognized. They weren't engineers, they were corporate fixers. Arian would spend hours behind closed doors with them, and when he finally emerged, he wouldn't look at me. It was as if I were a piece of furniture, necessary for the office, but utterly devoid of agency. The red flags started as subtle shifts in communication. Meetings that used to be inclusive became exclusive, invite-only sessions. My seat at the table was slowly pushed to the periphery. I would bring up technical debt or security vulnerabilities, and Arian would cut me off with a patronizing wave of his hand. "Leave the heavy lifting to the infrastructure team, Faisal," he'd say. "You've done your part. Focus on the vision, not the plumbing." But it was the isolation that hurt them most. One morning, I sat down at my desk to push a critical patch to our core algorithm, the heart of our system. When I hit enter, my screen flashed red, access denied. I blinked, sure it was a glitch. I tried again, my pulse quickening. Access denied. I called the head of IT, my voice tight. "There's a mistake with my credentials." There was a long silence on the other end, the kind of silence that feels heavy with pre-planned apology. "Faisal," he said, his voice barely audible, "we've been instructed to restrict your access to the core repositories for security reasons regarding the upcoming Series B audit." I felt the blood drain from my face. I was the one who wrote the security protocols. I was the architect of our digital fortress. I stood up, my chair clattering behind me, and marched straight to Arian's office. I didn't knock. He was on a call, but he signaled me to wait. I stood there, trembling with a mixture of betrayal and anger. When he finally hung up, he didn't even look up from his phone. "Arian, what is going on?" I demanded. "Why is my access restricted?" He leaned back, putting his phone face down on the desk with a deliberate, calm motion. "It's a standard corporate protocol, Faisal," he said, his voice as smooth as glass. "Investors are jittery. They want a clean, audited environment. Having a co-founder with unrestricted access to the source code during a high-stakes audit is a liability. Don't take it personally. It's business." Business. That word became a recurring refrain, a dull ache in the back of my mind. It was business when they hired their own people to replace my team. It was business when they reallocated my budget. It was business when I found myself working in a cubicle near the supply closet instead of the executive suite. The breaking point arrived 2 weeks later. I was searching the communal storage closet for a spare Ethernet cable, a humble task that felt symbolic of my diminishing status, when I found a tablet wedged behind a stack of unused monitors. It was unlocked, open to a cloud drive account labeled Nexus Flow Internal. Curiosity, sharp and jagged, pricked at me. I clicked on a folder named Project Erasure. The document within was titled Transition Roadmap. As I scrolled, my heart plummeted. It wasn't just a plan to audit the software. It was a blueprint to dismantle my role entirely. At the very top, listed under internal risks, was my name, Faisal Salman. Beside it, a bulleted list of legal maneuvers. Terminate employment contract for intellectual property breach. Initiate NDA lawsuit to seize personal assets. Rebrand core algorithms as proprietary Nexus Flow Tech. I felt like I was drowning. They weren't just pushing me out. They were preparing to execute a digital assassination. Every hour I'd spent in that basement, every dollar I'd invested, it was all being used as ammunition to destroy me. The betrayal didn't break me, it sharpened me. For 48 hours, I sat in my dark apartment, the only light coming from the flickering street lamp outside my window. I replayed every interaction, every meeting, and every corporate protocol. Excuse Arian had fed me. They had a roadmap to erase me, but they had made one fatal error. They assumed that the man who built their kingdom was too soft to protect it. They treated me like an employee, but I was the creator. And a creator always holds the master key to their creation. I realized I had exactly 30 days before their scheduled Series B funding announcement. This was their big stage moment, where they intended to secure millions and permanently lock me out. If they succeeded, they would have the legal war chest to bury me in court for years. I didn't need to defeat their lawyers. I needed to destroy their leverage. The planning phase was an exercise in precision. I knew that the Nexus Flow software was programmed to sync with a master server every 24 hours. During the initial development phase, in a moment of paranoia that now felt like divine intervention, I had hard-coded a unique signature into the kernel. It was a sequence of thousands of lines of code that, when compiled in a specific sequence, spelled out my name, my biometric authentication hash, and the original timestamps of the project's inception in binary. It was hidden deep within the sublayers of the architecture, masked by layers of dummy code. Even the most rigorous code review wouldn't find it unless they knew exactly where to look, and the consultants Arian had hired were far too arrogant to look for a signature in the foundation. But finding the signature wasn't enough. I needed a catalyst. I spent the next 3 weeks operating like a phantom. I used a private VPN to tunnel into our legacy backups, scrubbing my activity logs, and creating a digital footprint that made it appear as though I was working from a remote server in another continent. I was terrified. One wrong move, one flag packet, and they would have me arrested for data theft. But I had nothing left to lose. I designed what I called a dead man switch. It was a sophisticated logic bomb, a piece of code that would lay dormant, invisible to their standard security monitoring tools. I programmed it to trigger exactly at the 15-minute mark of their live investor demonstration. The condition for the switch was simple. If the master server did not receive a keep alive signal from my private, encrypted hardware key, it would initiate a system-wide audit. The audit wasn't just going to display my name. It was designed to pull every metadata log from the last 3 years. It would map out the true version history of the software, showing every file transfer Arian had made to hide his embezzlement, every document he had faked to claim ownership, and every communication he had with the consultants regarding the blacklist. It was a digital suicide note for the company, but only if they continued their charade. Every night, I would run simulations in my head. I walked through the demonstration scenarios. I anticipated their security team's reaction. I built redundant failure states to ensure that even if they tried to pull the plug, the data would already be mirrored to a public-facing repository I had prepared. I wasn't just coding a patch. I was scripting a tragedy. The most agonizing part of the planning was the silence. I had to continue going into the office, sitting in that cubicle near the supply closet, enduring the cold glares of Aryan sycophants. I had to smile when they asked about the upcoming transition. I had to play the part of the fading co-founder while I was holding the detonator under their entire empire. I saw Aryan in the hallway one afternoon, laughing with an investor, and for a split second, I felt a pang of nostalgia for the friendship we used to have. But then I looked at his expensive suit, paid for with the inheritance I had sacrificed, and the guilt evaporated. He hadn't just stolen my work, he had stolen my life's mission. And now, he was going to learn the cost of that theft. The day of the Series B launch dawned with a cold, piercing clarity. I arrived at the convention center 3 hours early, dressed in a sharp, dark suit that felt like armor. My heart was a steady, rhythmic thrum against my ribs. No fear, only a clinical, focused resolve. The hall was massive, a cathedral of corporate ambition filled with the soft murmur of venture capitalists, tech journalists, and industry titans. I took my seat in the very back row, tucked into the shadows where I could observe everything without being noticed. Arian was on stage, a golden boy bathed in spotlights. He looked every bit the visionary leader, gesturing expansively toward a giant screen displaying the Nexus Flow dashboard, a beautiful, sleek interface that showcased the stolen power of my algorithms. He was talking about pioneering the future and disruptive architecture. The crowd was mesmerized. I watched the investors, their eyes wide, some already tapping furiously on their tablets, ready to wire millions into an account that Arian thought he would control forever. I glanced at my watch, 10:14 a.m. The presentation was scheduled for 45 minutes. I had programmed the dead man switch to trigger at the 15-minute mark. Arian began a live demonstration, showing off the software's real-time data analysis. He was charming, confident, and completely oblivious to the digital fuse burning beneath his feet. I felt a strange sense of detachment, as if I were watching a movie where I already knew the ending. My phone felt heavy in my pocket, the hardware key resting inside like a dormant bomb. I didn't need to press anything. I just needed to exist and let the system do its work. At 10:15 a.m. exactly, Arian clicked a launch button on the screen to simulate a high-traffic environment. The screen flickered, a momentary glitch that Arian laughed off as a minor server handshake adjustment. But then, the screen didn't return to the dashboard. The software froze. The silence that descended upon that convention center was instantaneous and absolute, a vacuum that sucked the air out of the room. On the massive projection screen, the sleek UI dissolved, replaced by a terminal window. Black screen, glowing green text, scrolling at a speed that felt deliberate and mocking. Accessing master repository. Audit log initiated. Arian's smile faltered, his hand hovering over the mouse. Just a small technical hiccup, he stammered into his microphone, his voice an octave higher than before. The demo environment it's just refreshing. But the screen kept scrolling. It wasn't just code anymore. A window popped up, displaying a scanned PDF of the original incorporation document. My name, Faisal Salman, was highlighted in vibrant, flashing red, followed by the timestamp of the first kernel write, June 12, 2021. Then, a second document appeared, a chain of emails from Arian to his consultants, titled Project Erasure, Implementation Strategy. The murmur in the hall turned into an uproar. I saw a lead investor, a woman who had been ready to commit $10 million just moments ago, stand up and walk toward the stage, her phone pressed to her ear. Arian looked around, frantic, his eyes scanning the crowd as if he could spot the source of the leak, as if he could physically grab the air and stop the truth from unfolding. Then came the final blow. My binary signature, my name and the creation date, began to scroll across the screen in a repetitive loop. It was a digital fingerprint that no court in the world could ignore. A video began to play. A recorded conversation between Arian and one of his fixers, discussing the exact method of falsifying the patent documents. Every word was crystal clear, amplified by the hall's high-end sound system. Arian's face turned a shade of gray I didn't know existed. He didn't even try to speak. He looked like a man who had been hollowed out from the inside. Security guards were already moving toward the stage. I watched as the lead investor pointed a finger at him, her face a mask of cold fury. Within minutes, the police had entered the hall. As Arian was led off the stage, his hands zip-tied, he caught a glimpse of the back of the room. For one fleeting second, our eyes locked. He saw me. He saw the man he thought he had erased, the man who had stood in the basement while he lived the high life, the man who had ultimately reclaimed his kingdom. The fall was spectacular. Nexus Flow didn't just crash, it evaporated. Within 48 hours, the lawsuits were flying, the assets were frozen, and Arian was facing charges of massive financial fraud and intellectual property theft. The industry didn't just turn on him, they devoured him. I left the convention center quietly, stepping out into the cool, bright air of a city that suddenly felt like it belonged to me again. I had reclaimed my intellectual property, my dignity, and my future. I didn't walk away with the millions he had stolen, but I walked away with something far more valuable: the truth. As I walked down the street, I pulled out my phone and deleted the remote access app. The server went dark. The foundation was leveled, and for the first time in years, the slate was clean. I had burned their empire to the ground, and standing in the ashes, I finally knew exactly who I was.